sanitation on the previously adopted resolution of the City Planning Commission to declare an intent to amend the zoning regulations set forth in Chapter 30 of the Richmond City Code regarding tobacco, nicotine, and hemp product retail sale locations. Dr. Ross will be providing you with this update.
Thank you. Unfortunately, this is our last discussion before we move into actual ordinance for consideration. What's that? Well, this is, I think, important in terms of, I'll say, setting the stage for what we aim to propose. And just making sure that, I think part of our discussions is reflecting the feedback that I've received from this body in terms of the direction that we'd like to move in terms of setting ordinance for consideration. So, part that I want to talk a little bit more about today will be regarding districts, but I think just to go through our time to put everything together to kind of show, again, our body of evidence of where we're heading with this. So, again, establishing how to regulate these things, believing through the powers granted to us through our charter and ordinance, what the zoning ordinance is intended to do. That is to promote health, sanitation, and general welfare, and specifically regulating tobacco, nicotine, and hemp products as part of that promotion of health, sanitation, and general welfare. So, getting back to the start, how do we define retail sales of tobacco and hemp? And this is going to be, I think, something that we've talked about as a threshold that makes something truly an outlet of retail sales of these products. So what we're looking to propose is any business, establishment, or use that sells, offers, or distributes. And again, I'm just thinking out loud in terms of loopholes potentially for entities to get around this. Electronic smoking devices, retail tobacco products, as terms are defined in Code of Virginia. I think it's important that we just reference Code of Virginia in terms of where things are regulated there. So as that changes, we don't have to go through and change our ordinance or try and figure out what those are. It's like vapes today. I don't know what's going to be in 20 years. Probably something we haven't thought of yet. But so just as that evolves, we'll keep up with that. Same thing in terms of hemp products intended for smoking. Right? There's been a lot of discussion about how those are regulated recently. And so I think also to preemptively prepare ourselves for potential different uses of those within the Commonwealth. And where one or more of the following apply. And again, I think this is to look at opportunities that, any one of these conditions can potentially classify into retail sales of tobacco and hemp. So one, this is, I'll say, yes to all the things we've discussed. So 10% or more of the usable floor area, building or structure that's dedicated towards the sale, offering, or distribution of these materials, or 10% of the total merchandise display area. So again, it talks about measurements vertically or horizontally. So we're just trying to be very, I'll say, encompassing on that. 10% or more of the total sign area on the lot. So, right, not talking about regulating signage, but hey, for signage outside, 10% or more of it's going to be dedicated towards those specific things, like that is your bread and butter in terms of products you're selling. 10% of the stock and trade of business or establishment comprised of such materials. So, all right, maybe you don't put it all on display, but really, that is what you have all in the back room. Just come up to a counter to get it. And in the same way, we've also talked, this is follow-up conversations with our neighboring establishments and brief, but I think some additional conversations with other parties, and that is looking at also sales. I'll say this is probably a more challenging one that we might have to go through a legal process to obtain these from somebody, but I think we've proved reasonable evidence that this exists. Kind of be able to skirt the first four. I think one of these five is for us something that establishes that threshold of making retail establishment for tobacco. So that is, I think, what we'll be closing in terms of definitions, clause for clause, and any questions on discussions.
10%.
What's that?
10%.
So 10% we have used, and then look, some have used 10%, some have used 15%, some have used 20%. I think 10% is something, I'll say, a reasonable or customary standard that once you're over and above, like, hey, this seems to be like more than just like, say there becomes some significance to it. I think some have said, look, maybe you go 80-20, and that like a 20% threshold is maybe more reasonable. I think based on some of the conversation we've had and the politics around this, to push this to be as aggressive as possible. But to me, like 10% is not just like a rounding area. There's some substance to it in terms of like, all right, there's a significant portion of that business that comes from that. And what I'm saying maybe is also like, look, you know, if you lose 10% of your business, like that's a pretty significant thing. Sure.
I think the definition section is way better. That was the only concern I had in earlier drafts, is how we define this type of adoption. The one word that jumped out at distribute. Help me understand that particularly. I'm trying to. I'm thinking back to the way the armed forces used to distribute cigarettes to all members of the armed forces for free, and the companies did that. Is that what we're after? You think anybody's going to be giving this stuff away?
Well,
I'm just curious.
Yeah, and I would say, look, I'm just trying to think proactively about loopholes around this, and so whether somebody, you know, for that instance, right, is starting through that, and maybe like I'll say, in a way, right, maybe receiving funds indirectly through some other source, and then they just become, you know, instead of the point of sale, the point of distribution. You know, or in some cases, I don't know, somebody hits it big and just decides like they want to give out these tobacco products. I'm just trying to think of ways in terms of like, right, the transfer of the product from one person or one firm to a person. How can that be done? I don't know. I don't think it's a very smart business model, but I'm just also trying to think of like, I don't know, maybe there's a way around that somebody would just say, hey, all I'm doing is distributing here.
I don't have any objection to it. It was a word that just jumped out because, you know, defense lawyer in there thinks about distribution of certain products.
Yeah, that was a case in and I'm not sure if it, what you're going for, but I think in D.C. they had a place where folks could go and buy a carton, and the cost of the was the cost of the product, and so they would give away the quote unquote give away the product, so they weren't selling it, they were buying product.
Yeah, you buy a sticker. And then okay.
Yeah, divide it 25 cents.
So I've heard.
Right. So I just think again, trying to think in terms of trying to get to the front of somebody who could be trying to skirt some things.
Number 5, how do you get that?
Ask nicely.
Say no.
So this is a conversation I had just a little bit with Commonwealth's attorney in terms of, I think one thing is, I think that one would probably have to be ordered likely through a court. Hopefully we would set off something on one of the other 4 criteria in order to deem somebody one of those. But I think if we were to provide reasonable evidence that, look, you know, I'll say just we have somebody sitting outside the store for 2 hours and you see 9 out of 10 customers come out with tobacco and or hemp products and building a case for that. Again, it may have to be obtained legally through a judge or a court order, but I think it's important to have that in there so that we can say, hey, we're unable to establish most before, but like we have reasonable belief that number 5 is happening. So it's a higher burden to get, but I think we should have it in there in case we can't get there with it.
So I'm okay with that as long as it's not going to the finance department so you can do those.
Yeah. So one of the one of the discussions we had was about, being able to obtain data about, it's called the cigarette stickers, right? But in a lot of cases, those go to like the distributors, and so like you don't know where the actual product is going, and so I don't think that is a way we're going to go through. And I would say in terms of like the finance of those records, like that would not be, in terms of like us looking at that my mind would be crafted is not the avenue to obtain that information.
Yeah, they can't give it to you.
Well, I agree, yes.
They can give it, not that particular information. I think they could in application locate their CO. If they don't provide the information showing to the judge that there's reasonable belief that the company's CO, I think that's an advantage.
If it's just a court order, that's
Sure.
different.
All different.
I'm just saying, I don't want Kevin going to Sheila, so finance director, say, hey, I need a course of fee for business.
No.
Do you envision this being enforcing this sort of being more complaint-based? Because it seems like it would be a huge undertaking for someone who's involved to go to each of these shops to see if they're in compliance, or unless you collect on information like how different prices. It seems to me like an after way to enforcement start saying you have the authority to go in and ask if it succeeds on this work order that takes stuff. I just can't. It seems like a lot of work to go and harass and chase and establish the I'm not trying to give away a loophole.
No.
I'm not, but
I would say yes, it will be. I think part of what we've done and are working on is one, beefing up our zoning enforcement staff, again, dealing with, specifically complaints about short-term rentals. I think in terms of not only zoning, but a few things. One, being able to flag this or catch this during building permit processes or COs. Obviously, right, you get a CO and sometimes, right, take two, you go around and rearrange the store. This may be something that we need to talk about. I do feel it could be also a fit for our CCT or Community Code Enforcement team, where we do partner, especially with RPD, who's had issue with some of these stores in terms of other activities associated with it. We do partner with finance in terms of like, hey, you don't have a business license, you haven't been paying taxes on things. And so I think in terms of there may be opportunities for, I'll just say, like targeted efforts where we've done that in the past where, right, we've gone either on corridors or we've looked at convenience stores in particular. And so I think there's ways that we would probably, yes, obviously follow up on complaints we received, but we'd have to talk about a strategy about enforcement. But I do see, I'll say, some relevance with their CCT, only because like there are other issues associated with these establishments.
I'm not opposing a proactive approach. I just made this second presentation today where the city going out and making inspections essentially and just alien into just short rentals. There's only so much manpower and staff involved. So I want to get a position where you have something and committed staff to expand it. It sounds like you guys want to or it could be a second thought to be laughing about a lot of money.
Until they substitute marijuana for hemp. That's going to be a whole different ball.
So I do feel that we've seen this presentation multiple times, maybe more proactive, take more step back.
I do want to emphasize what Mr. White said and agree with him. This is a vastly improved approach and a solution to that.
Thank you. Not done. Just wanted to pause. So again, I think just talking about like why we regulate these things, talking about the regulations, obviously this goes back to the health, safety, welfare in terms of just there's well documented correlation between access to tobacco nicotine and negative health outcomes, especially in children. So, new thing we haven't talked about is where to allow retail sales of tobacco. And so, I think again, in terms of the life, health, safety arguments of having separation between particular uses and places where children are customarily or generally found. We've done some restrictions when it comes to adult uses, lodging houses, nightclubs, and retail sales of liquor. I don't want to go into today, but I'm really curious, why we have retail sales of liquor, because Commonwealth does it. I don't know if that's a preemptive step in case the Commonwealth would decide to privatize it somewhere, but we have that in there. So obviously we've thought about hey, if that ever were to change, we want to place some restrictions on where these entities could be located. And so there are 14 districts that allow some of these uses. Adult uses, it's permitted by having a star because I think we've talked about before, right? There's some buffering requirements in terms of where those can be located. The rest of them have conditional use permits. So as you can see through this matrix, they start to be in the business districts, UB, and then B2 up through B6. And then RF, CM, DCC, RP, and then the manufacturing districts, right? Kind of our most, inclusive, relaxed in terms of regulation. So the thought is, I guess the feedback question is in terms of following the logic of where we're having these restrictions on particular uses, in the same aspect for allowing for retail sales of tobacco and hemp products. Would you follow the same logic and pick all of these 14 categories? Would you pick fewer? Where do we come down in terms of these uses being permitted? Again, I understand going through a code right now, but I think just in the sense of generally it's been some of the business districts and the manufacturing districts who have allowed this. We want to recommend that moving.
Are breweries considered, do they come into retail sales of liquor? Or next meeting, but and they sell their products. So.
I do not have to go look at that definition again in terms of retail sales. I believe that refers to spirits and not malt beverages.
We have retail sales liquor.
Yes, we do have some distilleries.
Yep.
And they are, I believe, in F
series. One other. At least one other.
Yep.
Those are the problems destinations, drinks outside, the truck, a lot of children there.
So you're saying retail sales of liquor may not necessarily be the right exact terms?
I mean, I think where you're going to, you could still, I guess if you're looking for restricting, probably restricting that should be checked, but there's something different for breweries and distilleries, particularly for liquor.
You need to look at where liquor is defined.
Yeah.
I think that's where you find the answer to that question. I suspect it's talking about using a higher percentage of alcohol. Mr. Law talking about high sales liquor.
Just something that allow us
Sure. Yeah. Other thoughts? On the districts.
Obviously, you spend a lot of time and energy.
And then just talking about conditioning such uses. I think when we talk about buffers, again, as part of even CUPs, we talk about additional conditions in there that are subject to a few things. So we've talked about having a 1,000-foot buffer. residential zones. This is something that will probably, outside of today, really need to fully vet the city attorney. But I want to make sure that we're coming out. Again, I think talked about the notion to be as aggressive as possible on this, thinking about places, again, where kids are present or others that may be susceptible to, I'll say, concerns about alcohol or drug or tobacco use. And I think that where I put this is like just given the uncertainty in terms of like hemp regulations moving forward. And then also, again, just in terms of clustering and spacing, right? We have other uses that require spacing from each other. We talked about this before, and so, right, buffering, like what does that end up looking like? So the one on the left is our districts, schools, day centers, also ones that are defined or registered with the Commonwealth, 1,000 feet around those, and then the one on the right, we added parks, which adds a little bit more buffering. So these would basically become restrictions in terms of where you can start the process of applying for a CUP. I will say there's always still going to be like a special use permit process, right, to go through and consider these. But from the start, these would be buffered zones from where you could even start that process for the city. And then conditions also, these go with retail sales of liquor, but I think establishing restrictions that, look, it's not going to be drive-up facilities, and then they're going to take place with the interior of the building. We're not going to have a yard sale in terms of selling or distributing these products. So, I hope this is the final, discussion that we have, and then we move on to something substantial going forward.
I'm sorry.
Yep. Sure.
Are existing shops grandfathered? And are you have a CO?
So in terms of use, most likely, yes. I think we'll have some conversations about in terms of also continuous use, but then also, again, I don't think in terms of even from a zoning perspective, they make it grandfathered in terms of operating, but also from a just public safety perspective, I don't think that excludes them from any enforcement efforts in terms of other things that may be happening there, just to ensure compliance. Again, building code, zoning code, and other issues that may be.
Any other questions for the director?
No, first time to appreciate the level of thought. Almost as if you went undercover and just hopped around the city.
What happens if you see me without a bow tie?
Little mustache.
Any other questions for the director? In keeping with my normal course conduct, I'm going to open the public hearing and ask if there's any member of the public who wishes to speak with respect to the presentation made by the director. Anyone online?
Yes.
Close the public hearing. You don't need to vote on this.
We do have somebody online.
Everybody?
We do have somebody online.
Oh, we do?
Yes.
Oh, good.
Just raise your hand. Mark Ollinger. You can unmute and address the stage.
Welcome, Mr. Oliver.
There we go. Good afternoon, everybody. Mark Ollinger, Churchill Central Civic Association. I originally raised my hand because I wasn't sure Kevin the director was going to get to where I wanted to ask my question, but this is probably outside of housing issues, some of the development issues, the single largest topic of conversation in our area. And we've had some people contact me who are very concerned about buffering requirement. I live across the street, full disclosure, from a place that is going to open up any day now that would meet this test. And it is literally 60 feet from a park. that we've been working very diligently on to get fixed up, and we'll have our planting party on May 3rd. These are real challenges in commercial districts. I mean, I know you had the issue when I was last there about the project off in Southside about the apartments and all the light issues and signage issues. And the better we can help manage the proliferation of these places in some of our neighborhoods, particularly the interior of our neighborhoods, will be well done. I'm concerned, as always, about the hours of operation and some uses in the interior of neighborhoods as well, and that wasn't mentioned. But, I mean, I think hours of operation, distance from certain uses, including schools and parks, certainly at the top of the list, and other items would be items that I think we are interested in as this process comes forward, and we'll weigh in at that time when those things get introduced.
Any questions for Stolen? Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other member of the public? First public. Don't have to go to council action update.
Yes, so City Council met on March 10th, and I don't have any updates on anything being approved at that meeting, but there were 7 new special use permits that were introduced, and those will all be on your April 1st agenda, which is our next planning commission meeting, as well as the return of 7100 Shank Road and 5015 Sneed Road. And then the 3 UDC items that were forwarded to UDC at the last meeting, they were considered by UDC last week, so those will also be on the agenda. It's a lot of items.
Anything else? Thank you all very much.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you.